Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. Today, I'm a solo flyer in the sense that my normal, very, very capable wing person, Sarah, is not available today. And today's talk will be, and interview will be quite shorter than normal, but it's going to be an extremely interesting one. Our guest today is a young lady by the name of Danielle Marie Hurren. Now, I first came across Danielle around about 6 or 7 years ago, I think, when she contacted me, and we subsequently met at Breaking Convention, which is a fascinating event that takes place at the University of Greenwich every 2 years. And it should have actually taken place last year, and we're hoping that maybe it'll be starting up again this year, which is a fascinating series of, I think it's around about 3 days of lectures, talks, all about some fascinating subjects to do with entheogens, altered states of consciousness, this kind of thing. So without further ado, Danielle, can you tell me a little bit about yourself? I know about your adventures and I've been following them, but I know very little about yourself and your background. So how did you get into the world you exist within? Because I always love your tagline on Facebook where you turn around, never had a job and never want one, which I always think is wonderful.
Yeah. So this is actually, it's a Smiths lyric, which I really like. Yeah, from one of my favorite bands. And yeah, I mean, it's such a hard question, isn't it, when someone asks, how have you kind of ended up where you are? I think it was gradual. I grew up in the Suffolk countryside and in Essex also. And then I started to sort of, I think bit by bit, travel further afield and to explore different parts of my near surroundings. And I think the more I did that, I realized the benefits of it, perhaps not consciously, but I realized how much I actually enjoyed connecting landscape and realizing how places which I'd normally driven to, I could actually walk to, and they connected to my home. And I think when I realized that, I started to just want to travel further and further and further. And as soon as I sort of could, I actually moved to Ireland for quite a while. Then I lived in London, which is when we met. After that, I went to Italy and started to get more and more into the writing side of things, which is my real love alongside journeying and traveling. So I feel like it's been a natural progression to keep pushing the boundaries. And when you come to the edge of one place, push it further and start to explore further. And for a long time, I actually only walked in the UK, and now I've started to walk much more in Europe. And I think that's going to be a continual progression of wanting to walk further afield.
It's interesting you mention that your interest in the countryside and the relationship between us as human beings and the countryside, because I used to live in Colchester. And I very much, although I'm not originally from East Anglia at all, I found something incredibly magical about the countryside, particularly the Essex coastline, that kind of magical feeling you get there of wildness. But also when you go into Suffolk and you get into the villages in Suffolk, and there's this kind of timeless feel that you have where you feel that history is right in front of you. And particularly then when you move into the fen country and then it gets flatter and wilder. But I think East Anglia has got this magical feel to it. And it comes as no surprise that I think your interest in this started growing up in that particular part of the world, because it is timeless in some way. The only other place I feel the similar way is Greece. And I get that feeling in Greece where there's kind of a feeling of timelessness. But when we talk about journeying and walking, you're going through the physical landscape. In what way do you think that such journeys can also be seen as an example of taking pathways through the mental landscape as well? We have an inner world and an inner geography, and we have an external geography that we seem to be the interface between. Our perceptions of the world or the interface between that. Can you comment on that or anything about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first, just to say, I love what you said about East Anglia. That's so beautiful. And I think I've never really had anyone articulate that, but I feel precisely the same. I think I grew up in this landscape, and we did a lot of walking. Like my father's a great walker, so we went to the fens a lot. We went to places like Aldborough, where you have this just huge expanse of sky and coast. And yeah, I think it's no surprise that some of the greatest myths in the UK are from East Anglia. You have like the myth of Black Shuck, the dog, and there's a church in Blytheborough where people claim you can see the claw marks of the dog when he burst into a ceremony one Sunday. And these great tales, and of course the East Anglia was like the heart of the witch trials as well in the UK.
And Manningtree, yes.
Manningtree, exactly. There's a huge history when you walk this land, and I feel East Anglia is in my heart always, that there's nowhere like it. And perhaps that's actually where I first started to have that experience, of landscape being some kind of interface and some kind of connection between what was going on internally and what's happening externally. Because I think when you have a landscape where you feel a lack of boundaries, you feel like you have a great flat land and a huge sky, I feel it does something to your brain. You feel like you are that entire landscape. I read a great quote by the Portuguese writer Fernando Pessoa recently, where he was talking about being in his home village, and from his home village he could only see one tiny part of the world, but because that was all he could see in the horizon, it became the world. And in that sense, sort of, he became the world. It really feels like that you're no longer limited inside walls, but you're suddenly able to occupy this huge space. And I think that promotes a kind of fluidity of thought and ideas, which almost feels transcendental. I think many writers have felt that. And Emily Bronte is a classic. Like, Emily's relationship with the moors was something extremely, I think, profound and spiritual and key to her work. She went to the moors to write her poetry, and she often compares the moor to an ocean, to this sort of boundless landscape. So I think the relationship is it's communicating our minds and the landscape, that they're not separate things. I don't think you can ever separate the two. Like, whatever landscape you're in, it's visual, and it directs your thoughts in some way. If we stay inside all day long staring at walls, we'll feel funny at the end of the day, and we'll feel very different than if we spend a day walking a mountain and seeing a huge vista. And I think that was also really profound during lockdown and during this time when we were all inside for a long time, and unless you lived in a rural environment, you didn't get great vistas. I was in Rome at the time, in Italy, and my only view, I would go out onto my tiny balcony and I had a view of the apartments across the streets. But if I sort of leaned my head towards the left, I could see the hints of the blue hills of Castel Gandolfo. And I used to just stare at them to try and get this, perspective, to make me feel better, to make me feel like I wasn't so enclosed.
I think one of the experiences that stick in my mind in terms of the Italian landscape is when you're in places like Florence or Firenze, and you go up outside of the city to some of the villages that are around the rim of the hills that surround, and you can look down on Florence, then you can look over the Tuscan countryside, and as you say, it has this kind of flowing, rolling feel, and you have this feeling of touching something that is almost numinous, in the sense that you suddenly are flooded with this feeling of at oneness with nature. And I'm reminded here of particularly the writings of the Lakeland poets, people such as Wordsworth, and the ideas of how the Romantic poets worked. And I think your wonderful comment about Bronte as well is really interesting, isn't it? The moorland feel. And of course, in East Anglia as well, before we move on, because I'm quite fascinated on the East Anglian thing, we have the kind of the strange feeling, for instance, in Dunwich, you know, where you have the drowned village, and the idea that at certain times you can hear the bell ringing out in the North Sea. And again, this is almost the kind of, it's liminal, isn't it? We have the edge of the known world, which is the land, and then we have this hidden place, which is the sea, which is vast. And goes out, and the sea can eat up the land in some way. And I'd never thought about it before. And a previous guest on this show was a lady called Kaz Coronel. And Kaz was talking to me a few months ago, and she was saying one of the things that she finds most important, it'd be interesting to have your point on this, where she said that she thinks it's profoundly important that when you go out into the countryside, you should take your shoes and socks off. And you should actually walk with your feet in contact with the ground, because you feel with the telluric forces. Have you ever come across that in your walking, that feeling and sensation of that?
Yes, I think I would relate that to the feeling of being purely exposed. And I think that it's something which occurred to me. I walked the length of Britain towards the end of last year. And I feel like this entire walk was about fully exposing myself to landscape, because not only did I walk 9-10 hours a day, but I mostly slept outside because I was camping. So I really didn't have any walls around me at all. And I ended up, after maybe a good few weeks of this, feeling like I was sort of desperate just to be covered by something, you know, just to have something around me, some kind of shelter, not because of the elements, but because I was entirely exposed all the time to the sunlight, to the stars, to the vastness. And I think it's the vastness that you face when you walk, when you look at ocean or mountains. And that's something that you have to expose yourself to it. You have to, I think, be like just purely present, see it for what it is, feel it, you know, watch the waves, feel your skin on the earth. And I think it profoundly affects you when you do that. Like the last 4 days of my walk of Britain, I walked the north Scottish coast, so the northeast, and it was so exposed. It was like the perfect end to the walk, because it was almost treacherous at times. It's a coastal path, but it's a Scottish coastal path, so the laws around roaming are very different in Scotland, and you can pretty much walk where you like, but nothing's particularly managed, and there's certainly always kind of risk involved. And at times I was sort of tottering on the edge of cliffs. Wow. It was sort of, there were just sheer drops, and it's all unfenced, and this huge sea crashing beneath me. And it was incredible. It was like I was completely exposed to it. There was no one else there.
So you were doing this completely on your own then as well? You were just you. Wow.
Yeah, and it was November at that point, so it wasn't like the optimal time to be walking. And I'll never forget that feeling of just being so exposed. And there's really no shelter on that coast. Also, you have these strange graveyards as well on some of the cliffs, where there are no churches. There's just sort of a grave site, a small wall around it, and just an expanse of land, and then the cliff. And it feels like there's nowhere to hide from any of it. And I think it's that feeling that if you allow yourself to walk and you get to those places without boundaries, it's a revelation, that feeling. And yeah,
I can imagine, because that coastal path, I've been on the edge of that many years ago, and the huge vastness. And a few years ago, my sister and my brother-in-law drove up to Cape Wrath. And that's completely off-road, and they had a Land Rover and they drove there, and the situation was so boggy, as I recall, and I'm sure this is true, that they had to abandon the Land Rover in a bog because it sank into a bog, and they had to leave it there because there was nothing they could do. But they were in transport, and they were together, whereas you were doing it completely on your own. Were there times when you felt frightened or nervous, or was it always the magic of it all kept you going?
Sometimes I did, but I don't think it was a rational fear. I think it was the feeling of being exposed. And I had a few times that I'll never forget them, actually. And it was times when I was on a moor and I couldn't see any human habitation, and maybe the weather was bad. There was one particular time where I think it was the first time I really felt it, and I'd been walking for a long time. I'd come to a village where most people would stop, and I decided to push on. And I'd pushed on, and the weather had turned, and it was just howling, and I was on this moor, and you just couldn't see any signs of life. And I think that has an effect on me mentally, which isn't exactly rational. And it's because I can't see. If I could see a house, if I could see a Starbucks sign, I'd feel fine. But it's because I think we seek safety in community and numbers. And whenever I want to expose myself to this huge natural vastness, but there's a part of my brain which really doesn't want to do it. And I feel like there's always something of a conflict there, where I have to just tell it to be quiet and everything's fine. Like, you've got what you need. I've got water and food. If the worst comes to the worst, we'll put the tent up. It's not life and death, really. But I find that constant dichotomy happening in my head.
Because it must be an interesting challenge here, because there's probably two elements battling with each other when you're in these circumstances. And I was particularly interested in your point about the point you stop, because there's always the next hillside that you want to go. There's always the next thing you want to get towards. Yeah. But there's also a rational part of you saying, well, I might just stretch that too far. Yeah. And because you're on your own, there's nobody to rationally talk to you, is there? It's your decision alone.
Yes. And I think knowing your flaws is a really good thing. So walking helps you also to know yourself. You get to know your good points, your bad points. And I think I know that I'm an optimist. So I'll always think I can walk further than I can. And I always like walking until darkness. I actually do quite a lot of night hiking, because I love to see the sunsets, and then it sort of gets dark and I have to think about the rationale of where I'm going. But I do like it if I occasionally, when I was hiking Britain, I walked with friends, and I liked that dynamic, because they'd be the ones telling me maybe we should think about setting up the camp, and I'd be wanting to push everyone on till dark. So it's nice to have that. And because I know now that I'll always think that I can walk further than I can, I sort of act accordingly. So I tell myself, what I think I can walk, I'll probably do half of that before I should set up camp. So I think just learning that has really helped me, because before, when I started walking, I perhaps didn't know that about myself. So I would get myself sort of, I would walk for too long and it would be dark, and it was never a problem, but it's just something I learned about the way I think. I don't think I perceive time exactly correctly. So I always think it's I'm going to get somewhere that's actually quite far away.
Because this is it, isn't it? It's the self-discovery. It's the inner dialogue with yourself, and it's the discovering your own limitations, and also being aware of your own body in an environment as well. We ordinarily exist within houses, we exist within boxes. Whereas when you're out there in the environment, it's you and the environment. As you say, the barriers are down. And of course, this is one of the things that so many great writers and authors have said, that walking is something that really generates creativity within them and creative practices. Do you say that this is what you've discovered as well, in terms of your own creative writing as well, that you've found that your walking has facilitated this?
Yes. I see walking as an artistic practice, really, because whenever I walk, I experience this nowhere else, but when I walk, I get into a headspace where I just start to have ideas. And it's not only that, but I'll see something that I find interesting, and then I'll connect it to something else, and I start to get whole sentences just appear in my head. I can I can write so easily, it flows. There's no resistance to the creativity. And I've thought about this so much and tried to understand the reasons, like, why should it be that simply going for a walk allows creative thoughts? And I mean, I think one of those things is just purely the movement of it. I think moving feels so good. If you're moving from one point to another, I think you can have a similar effect on a train, or even if it's a vehicle. The sense of movement, because of this connection with landscape and thoughts, if you're moving through a landscape, it seems to get your thoughts moving. And once your thoughts are moving, it becomes so easy to get in that creative place. And for me, it's a really sacred place, because it's a different part of my brain than the one I normally use. So my everyday life, I'm using a very logical part of my brain. I teach most of the day, or I have to get from one place to another, or I have to organize things, and everything is very regimented and structured. I'm sort of in control of everything, right? But for me, creativity is about not being in control, and it's about, I feel like I'm passive when I create. I often use the analogy of floating in a pool of water or in the sea. And I feel like creativity is like, you go for a walk and you recline back in the water and you just let it carry you, and you just sort of watch as it's carrying you, and you're not in charge, you're not in control. The thoughts come, the ideas come, you just have to kind of connect them like a puzzle in a way that will make sense, or a way that will make the point that you want. But for me, it's about being completely passive. And it's why when I walk, I kind of go off grid, really. I don't really like to keep in touch with lots of people, because I feel like if I'm taken out of that state, it's really hard to get back. So I sort of just go into it and stay on this walk and stay in that place where I'm floating. And then sort of at the end of every day, I might sort of come out of it and make sure I'm in touch with loved ones and things. But it's something which is sacred, and I only ever find it in walking.
That is, again, very intriguing, because one of the books that fascinated me many years ago was Something of Me, written by Rudyard Kipling. And in that, Kipling discusses his own, how he writes and how he wrote. And you probably know he bought a beautiful house in East Sussex called Bateman's, where he used to wander in the gardens and the rose gardens and everything else. And he said, what you need to do is to find that stillness inside. And when you find the stillness, the vacuum is filled by what he called, and of course it's what I write about, the daemon, which is the force of creativity that seems to well up in the vastness and the emptiness of when you're in those kind of circumstances. And it's as if your brain needs the freedom, maybe to stimulate your non-dominant hemisphere for creative purposes or whatever. And what you're saying here, I'm finding fascinating, because I'd never thought about it before, but this is so profoundly true, isn't it? In order to be creative, you've got to look inwards and outwards at the same time, and use the stimuli you're receiving to just create something almost from the vacuum inside yourself. And this is why probably so many great writers do this. You know, they walk, and the creativity just comes. Do you find that when you're doing this, your creative ideas, do they just spontaneously occur? And could you give me any examples of that, of things that have, when you've been in these circumstances, something you've gone, where did that come from?
It happens all the time. Pretty much everything I write, that I've put online, that I've written during walks, it all came to me in that way. I kind of look, so every day of a walk, I try and create a diary of that day. So like a summary. I feel that every single walk, even if you're doing a through hike and you're on the same hike day after day, each day is its own separate contained thing. And at the end of that day, you feel something. And it's something which, it's almost like a color, or it's something which you feel deeply, or you see, but you haven't given it words, you haven't verbalized it. So my task at the end of every single day is to verbalize the impression of that day. And I often take it from, perhaps I met someone and we had an interesting dialogue, So I will start with that dialogue. And then I often find connections throughout the day that link with that initial dialogue. So maybe someone will mention a type of flower, and then I will see that flower as I'm walking. And then this will connect to something else that I see, which is historical along the path. And I often describe it as like finding the backbone of that day, because all narratives need a thread or something to hold them together. And for me, it's that one kind of idea of the day, which seems to, it almost feels like the universe is kind of talking to you, you know, that it's almost like there's kind of a message, or there's one main theme of that day, and you can find it being repeated and you can make a great story out of it. But so as I'm walking, I'll sort of be inspired by one idea and I'll be thinking about it. And then just from having a blank mind and looking at the forest I'm walking in, or looking at the sea, everything just pops into my head, just complete sentences. It just completely writes itself. Like I have to do nothing but be passive, and it's there.
This is again literally, you know, what Kipling said. You know, I think he actually used very similar words to yourself. You know, be passive, and it will come. And of course, here, you know, I'm getting ideas of, for instance, that wonderful book that Bill Bryson wrote, A Walk in the Woods, which they made a movie of. You know, and the idea of what walking does there. But of course, again, you know, you're stimulating so many ideas here. It's extraordinary. And I'm thinking, you know, the idea of sort of ancient man, you know, when we were more attuned to the environment and we lived outside and we hunted and we grew things, which we are now divorced from. But when you go on your walks, you're literally recreating that, aren't you? You're recreating that symbiotic relationship that human beings have with the environment around us. Extraordinary, extraordinary. So, and this brings us on to the concept of psychogeography, you know, the idea of the maps of the world and the maps of the mind, you know, and the connection between the two. I know this is an area that really fascinates you. And indeed, in terms of this, I'm reminded here, and when I was reading your work, I was reminded of there were a group of historians in France called the Lani, people like Marc Broc and Ferdinand Braudel, who were very interested in doing history from a different viewpoint, from the viewpoint you're taking. For instance, in his book, The Mediterranean, Braudel discussed what it was like, feudal society, sorry, Marc Bloch, and the idea of what it's like to live in a feudal society, whereby at night, darkness is dark. You know, you go to bed when the light goes out, and you're permanently cold and you're permanently in danger, but you feel far more alive because of that. You know, it's as if almost our world now is something we are looking out into because the world creates that. Whereas when you're out in the environment, it's more immediate, isn't it? So what's your thoughts on this inner and outer worlds and psychogeography?
Yes, I mean, you're making me actually think of a time when I was walking Britain, and again, I was at this northern coast of Scotland, and I was walking a thing called the John O'Groats Trail, which is this coastal path I was talking about, which is somewhat existent and somewhat not. So it lacks basic infrastructure of bridge crossings and stiles, and there's quite a bit of clambering to be done. And I decided, because you can just literally walk the A9, which is the single road that goes to the very northern eastern tip. And some people who walk this route, they just walk the A9. It's the easiest way, it's the quickest way, you'll have far less hassle, slightly dangerous with the cars, but if you want to get to your end destination, you walk the road. However, I didn't want, for me, the destination was never the point. I wanted to interact with the landscape. So of course I took the difficult option of climbing up these cliffs and
there's a cliff, let's climb it. Yeah.
Exactly. And I knew there were a few burn crossings and river crossings, and because it was November, I had no idea how crossable any of it would be. And one day I walked this beautiful beach. I mean, it was just extraordinary. I think people don't realize how amazing the beaches are in Scotland, like white sands, the sky was blue, there was an amazing sort of pink color as the sun was starting to set. And I just stood there and amazed, so happy that I was standing here on this beach. Like, I wasn't that far from the A9, but you feel like you're in another world. And I got to the point where I realized I couldn't cross a river. It was far too high, and I spent, maybe I wasted 30 minutes, even more, trying to cross it and trying to think. And I had my massive pack, so it's quite precarious because you don't want to fall over. You sort of, it's a bit of a balancing act. And I tried and tried and tried. And in the end decided I had to go back. I had to retrace all of my steps, go back to a suitable point where I could get back to the road. And I had to use the road to walk that section. So I did all this, and, you know, to one degree, it's frustrating because you think, I've just lost all this time, and if you're just trying to get to your endpoints. But what I found shocking was that when I finally got to the roads, I crossed that stream, that river, without even knowing it was there. I was on tarmac. I've got no idea what the landscape's doing anymore, because I'm just walking this road, which it's made for humans to get to where they want to go. And I've got absolutely no respect and no understanding for what the land itself is doing. And this taught me that, you know, difficulty is not always a bad thing. That struggle I had to cross the river, not only did I have this amazing moment on the beach, which I never would have discovered otherwise, but I truly was humbled by the landscape and was taught that actually there are lots of things which I can't cross, or I can't climb them. Like, the landscape has power and majesty in a way that is beyond me. And you feel all these incredible emotions that I feel like our society has just, it's lost them because we've gone for ease. And of course, that makes sense as a species. We want easy lives. We want to be able to move from one point to another and have shelter and food. And we've done all these things as very amazing evolved creatures, but we've lost an understanding and respect of what the land actually does. And through that, I think we've lost connection also with ourselves, because the land connects you back with yourself in this sort of feedback loop. So I think that's really important, and where psychogeography comes into it, because I think we have to start interacting with our landscape in a different way, like truly interacting with it and seeing what it is. And I think we can do the same in cities, you know, even if it's a man-made landscape we're walking in. The city is a landscape also. And I think if you walk it consciously and you realize that, okay, every single thing I'm walking now has been built by people, and I can't make any choices. I'm just sort of being directed around the city. And in that case, I'm being shown the mind of someone else. I'm being shown someone else's ideas and someone else's creation. And I have a good friend actually who he once did a project where he tried to walk across London without using any of the roads. So just like finding his own way and interacting with the landscape again in the kind of the same way that I did with the river. So taking some agency and seeing, yeah, how can I maneuver this landscape?
That's a fascinating point, isn't it? Of course, cities are created by other people. They're created from the ideas of other people, from the design of other people, and everything else. Whereas nature has all literally, well, not literally organically grown, but it has its own purpose. It has its own ideas of what it wants to do, and you know, it grows and it falls. I mean, for instance, one of the things that I was fascinated by whenever I'm up in Scotland and I think about the Grampian Mountains, and I think of how massive they would have been, because of course some of the oldest rocks in the world are up in Scotland. So you have this kind of literally billions of years of wind and water creating this incredible landscape. But, you know, could we argue, you know, there's no design to it? It's just nature in the raw, isn't it? You know, and in which case, you know, one of the things that from what you're saying here, one could very arguably say that walking like you do is very much, it's a radical act, isn't it? It's something that is taking you out of your comfort zone and is thrusting you into radical thought.
Yeah, exactly. And I still actually I recall the first time I ever went to Dartmoor. And Dartmoor was the first time I saw a landscape where there were no paths. And I remember that it terrified me because I was suddenly on this expanse of moor, and I had to make the choices of where to go. And I had to navigate, and like, why has someone not made this path for me already? You know, which is the way we're used to being. So I think by walking, you're being radical in so many ways, because depending on how you walk, if you walk off the main routes, you're just completely engaging with your landscape, and taking real agency, real responsibility. You're learning a profound lesson that nature was never about us. It's not made for us, which can be a profound lesson when you're walking in Scotland and you're scrambling up a mountain on Skye, which I've done, and it's treacherous. Like, there are no paths, and you've got to kind of make your own way. And that's, to really experience that is a great lesson, because otherwise, if you just live in environments which are made by humans, it can seem like everything is designed around us, and it's not at all. So I think some inconvenience in walking and in traveling is really, really beneficial. And just also, I think, just walking in itself, some people find it very strange. They don't understand why you're not in a car. And I think I've often been, particularly on my walk of Britain, towards the end, I had to walk some of the A9 before I got to the very northern points, because you have to cross a number of firths, and there's no way to cross them but to go over these huge bridges where many cars are passing. And just so many people stop and ask you if you want a lift. And mostly when I explained what I was doing, and I said, I've walked from Cornwall and I'm going to John O'Groats, they were very understanding. This one woman really wasn't, and she was actually quite cross with me, and she really wanted me to get in her car because she thought it was dangerous to be walking on this road. So I think it can be hard sometimes to explain why you're not in a car, and why are you doing this? Why, like, for what reason are you just using your feet to travel? It's something which opens a lot of conversations with people that you meet.
So you actually walked from Land's End to John O'Groats. Is that right?
Yeah.
And you did this completely on your own?
Yeah.
Wow. How long did that take you?
3 months. So you can walk it in 2, but I'm not the quickest walker, because I'm not interested in time, how long it takes me. I was interested in seeing everything, so I took my time.
Wow, extraordinary. Because this comes on to the next question. Where does intuition come into this? Because you must be intuiting all the time, because there's a plan to get to John O'Groats, and that is the plan. But everything else in between is arbitrary. And as we've already discussed, you're in this other state of consciousness almost, because of the experiences you're having. So we've touched upon this before, this idea of intuition. Are you driven by intuition, would you say?
I think you can be. There's something I occasionally like to do when I'm walking, and normally I do it in cities or towns more than on a trail, but occasionally I like to walk with no real sense of where I'm going, but only using intuition. So if I get to a new city, just walking along, which way do I think I would like to go? Which way do I feel? And I've done it a few times with amazing results. I think often you discover really interesting things. I once did this when I was in Falmouth, actually, in Cornwall. And I got there and I really wanted to see a friend of mine. And I thought, I'm just going to walk around and like just go to random streets and like see what happens, see if we bump into each other. And I did exactly that. I just sort of chose the one that I felt. And then I found my friend just sitting on this wall playing guitar. And it was just like the funnest thing ever. Yeah, just to think, I just I mean, I'm sure there are kind of, I guess, high odds that we would have seen each other, but I love that experience. And I often find that when I walk in that way, you just discover some wonderful things, because again, you're being more passive. You're not directing yourself to something. It's not, I've researched this thing and I'm going to go and look at it, but no, I'm going to see, where does the city want to take me? And you often find yourself looking at an interesting piece of graffiti, or a really wonderful church, or an area of green that you never would have discovered. So this is really fun. And I think I like to do it on longer walks a little bit, but you also have to be somewhat directed to get to your kind of main objective, which always saddens me, because I feel like when I'm walking a longer hike, you walk past so much. And it's a real shame, because you just don't have the freedom to go off the route all the time. Otherwise, it would just take so long. And I do have a job that I sort of have to come back for. So I sadly have time restraints, but I'd love to do that more and just spend a day intuitively walking.
I'm reminded here of Jacob Boehme, the mystic in the 17th century, when he turned around and he said one could go mad by just contemplating a pewter dish. And I think the point you're making here is that when you're walking, your focus is different and your attention is different, and you see things in a different way, because that's always that kind of shaking oneself out of the torpor that we normally have, and suddenly realizing, you know, this building is beautiful, or this tree is beautiful. Exactly. And you walk past it, but when you're walking through it, into it, as it were, into its world, you're seeing it in a very different way. You're interfacing with the natural forces in a far greater way. One of the things that I'm interested in here is in asking is, did you find that synchronicity started to occur? Because obviously it was fascinating you finding your friend. And I was reminded there was a science fiction writer called Robert Sheckley, who in the 1960s wrote a wonderful book, which I can't remember the name of now, but it was called, but one of the theories there was the law of searches. And the law of searches is that if you want to find somebody, one of you has to stay in one place, because if you're both wandering around looking for each other, you will never be in the same place. So one wonders, in terms of your friend, he was obviously located in a specific place playing the guitar in order for you to find him for some reason. But did synchronicities, were there any kind of things that occurred that you thought that was unusual?
I think the synchronicity I normally encounter is with mostly with ideas, I would say, because I think it happens all the time with what I'm writing. Like, as I said, I will, like, someone will sort of mention something to me in the morning, and then later in the day on that walk, I will see something that relates. And I feel like it's almost like there's a pre-written narrative that you're just sort of peeling off the layers and seeing it. And it's amusing and entertaining. It's a bit like a joke. I feel like that's kind of playing out all the time. So that amazes me more than anything. I think that's like continual synchronicity. Yeah, I mean, I haven't had any kind of profound synchronicity more so than that, but I think that probably is the, yeah, sort of.
So do you think when you're walking then, we've touched upon this as well, that there are other areas of the psyche that you only encounter when you are doing what you do? And I you know, it's extraordinary the way in which you've done these walks completely on your own. I had not realized that you were completely on your own. So you're finding your inner self, aren't you, as well? The other part of you that normally the loudness and the clamor of the world stops us thinking about. And have you found that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I loved your previous comments about how everything starts to look different, and how you see the beauty and majesty and things as you're walking. And it reminded me actually of Nan Shepherd's, who she was a woman who, she was a teacher and a writer, and she spent her entire life in the Cairngorms, in one particular area of the Cairngorms, just wandering around by herself. And she made this beautiful comment about how she could spend her entire life exploring just one lock of the Cairngorms, just one area, and she would never know it. Like, it would never be enough to understand that landscape. And I think that all the time when I walk, because you can never truly know anything, even the plant that you pass, or the tree, or just a certain area of landscape. It's too much. It's too vast. It has its own, it's changing all the time, its own beauty to it. And I think walking is about accepting that, and the fact that you can't own the landscape. You could devote your entire life to one corner of England, and you'll never really know it. So I think that's powerful, and that really changes your perception, because then everything you encounter becomes something overwhelming. And it's true that you can't live in that state forever, because if you lived your normal life like that, you're not going to get much done. And I think we have to filter out so much just to live our normal lives, and filter out not only beauty but other people. I think that walking also really taught me that other people are people. I think being in a city, and I mean, I've lived in London and I've lived in Rome, and I think when you're in a city and you see so many people every day, you can't compute that every single one of those people is a complete individual. It will be too much. So they all sort of become two-dimensional characters in the background of your own life. But when you walk, and particularly when you walk in a vast landscape, you see so few people that every single interaction becomes profound, and something that you really have long conversations. Like, if you're hiking in the mountains, and there have been times when I'd been alone for 10 hours and I would sort of see a little figure in the distance, and it's exciting. And I remember all of those people and all of their names. And then it changes you, because you come back to normal life, and I think you have more tolerance and understanding, and you realize, oh, the world's not what I simplified it to be at all. That's the world that we interact with normally is just it's a way that I think we've represented it, so it makes sense and we can just cope with it. But the world is vast and complex.
As you're probably far too young to remember the band Crosby, Stills and Nash and Young, but there's an album, they did a live album called Four-Way Street, and there's one point where David Crosby turns around and says sheer profundity. And I think what you're saying there is sheer profundity, because what you're doing is you're touching on so many areas here of the artistic process, what it is to be human, but also the psychological aspects of things such as filter theory. Henri Bergson, the idea that the brain is an attenuator, that it takes out information in order to help us function within the environments we find ourselves within. And could it be that when you are walking, the filters cease to be quite as effective because they don't need to be effective, and suddenly you're awash in the sensory world around you that stimulates the ideas? And again, with this, I'm reminded of those wonderful lines, a few lines written above Tintern Abbey by William Wordsworth, you know, why I'm touched by something profound, like it's hidden in the light of setting suns. And it's only when you're out walking on your own, following your own narrative, that you find yourself. And I think your point there is very interesting, that chance meetings suddenly on walks suddenly means something far more. You have to engage with somebody, don't you? You can't just walk past them, because you're figures in a landscape and you have narratives and stories. Really, really interesting. We're getting nearly towards the end, but one of the things that, I mean, this has been a wonderful conversation. I found it absolutely fascinating. I think we could talk for hours, and I think we have to have you back to go more about this, because what you say stimulates ideas in me. But one of the things the thing you did that really intrigued me was the walk in northern Spain to Santiago de Compostela. That must have been an extraordinary experience for you. Now, you know, I'm told that friends I know who've done that have said it's almost a profound spiritual experience as well. And it has this imbued history of people who've been doing that journey for so long. And I'm reminded here of the film that Michael Sheen did with Emilio Estevez, where they did that walk. Have you any comments or experiences of things, or just tell us a little bit about that walk and what it was like?
Yes. So I have so much to say on the Camino, and there's not enough time. I've done 2 Caminos now, which I think says a lot about how much of an effect it had on me. And I mean, it's a walk that I've been aware of the Camino for years. You hear people talking about it, and it was always kind of in the back of my mind. But I decided in December to walk the Portuguese Camino from Lisbon to Santiago. And yeah, I didn't really know anything about it. I just sort of packed a bag, went to Lisbon, and went to the cathedral, and thought, yeah, I'm gonna go. And yeah, it was so beautiful. And I think, I mean, it started off just being there was quite a lot of tarmac and farmland, and there was no one else around. I didn't see a single other person until I got to Porto, which was over a week of walking. And
so for a week you didn't see another human being?
I didn't see another walker.
Or another walker. Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I didn't see like any other pilgrims, because normally on the Camino there are many different routes, but normally, like on the French routes, it's so busy. You're often in sort of lines of walkers, but I didn't see anyone. So it was mostly just I walked alone, and then in the evenings, you normally stay at these places called albergues, which are like particular accommodation for pilgrims. And there was no one in them either. So often I'd have sort of the owner come along, and he'd let me into this. It's basically a house. And there was no one there. So after walking all day with my thoughts, I would then sit and write with my thoughts. And I just, yeah, it had a profound effect on me, the Portuguese Camino, because I think I'd always maintained the fact that I was a solo walker and that I loved to walk alone. And I kind of realized in the Camino that I'd never actually walked alone before, because I think I'd always had this sort of internal dialogue in my head, just kind of going round and round, which I think had not fully allowed me to be present and to experience landscape in the way I really could have. So, for example, I sort of realized this on the Camino, that I was not being fully present. And I decided that what I would do is I would tell all of those kind of thoughts or fears or different aspects of me to walk the Camino with me. So rather than trying to stop the worry or the things that I was thinking about, I would just invite all of that just to walk with me and to be present with it. And once I'd done that, I felt completely different. And I felt like I was walking without an agenda, and I was just being there. And I had this incredible moment where I came to a river, and I stopped and sat there, and there was something about the way the light was hitting the water that was hitting the water that was beautiful. And I sat there with it, and I didn't have anything else in my head. Like, it was a moment of real presence, which I think is something I'd never experienced before. It was just me and the water and the lights, and that was profound for me. And I think only the Camino could have taught me that. And yeah, I got to Santiago, and a month later I went back and I walked another route from a place called Orense in the north of Spain to Santiago, which was only 4 days, but it's all I had time-wise. And then I'm going to go back end of this month, and I'm going to walk the French routes. I only have 3 weeks, so it's going to be pretty hectic, but I'm going to try. So yes, I'm a big fan of the Camino.
do you intend to, coming to the end now, do you intend to actually, obviously you're making an awful lot of notes and writing, and presumably your plan is to publish a book or books based upon your walking experiences and things. Is that the intention?
Yes, so I have sort of 2 books that I'm working on right now, but the main one, it's actually about my walk of Britain, and it's tied in with lockdown and with the pandemic, and it basically starts in Rome and the lockdown, which I was there between February and July of 2020. So it starts off with this and then progresses on to the walk of Britain. And I'm studying with Faber Publishing House in London once a week for 6 months. And the aim is that at the end of the 6 months, I will have the completed manuscripts, which will be ready for submission to agents, and hopefully, yes, will be more complete than it is now. Because right now I've written all of it, but I've written it in the way that there are lots of parts missing and things that need to be connected. So it's always that kind of issue, I think, when you write as you're walking, because it's all done in this passive way, I end up with a lot of material, and then the more kind of, I guess, in control part of the brain or psyche has then got to come back home and sort of order it all and make it into a novel or a narrative that people will enjoy. So that's the part that I find more arduous.
Well, I think that is going to be absolutely extraordinary, and definitely put me down for a copy as soon as it comes out, because I think it's going to be an incredible work. And I think your intelligence and your fascination for things actually shines through. And I think that whatever you're about to achieve, I think is going to be extraordinary. Of that, I have no doubt. And I just suspected that of you when I first met you. There's just something, you have something there. And I think it's the kind of book that I think is needed. I think these days we are desperately searching for something. We've become too far away from what we really are and our inner selves. And I think writers like you, young writers that are coming up, are just so profoundly important, and seeing the world in the way you see it, which is extraordinary. And again, going back to the Jakob Boehme quote, I think your instance with the light bouncing off the water, I think again is a wonderful analogy, I think, for the kind of the spiritual quest, the inner quest, as well as the external quest, which you're talking about. Now, Danielle, is there any way people can contact you, or if do you have a website or anything yet, or whatever?
Yeah, so what I'm doing right now, I started an Instagram page for the walks, which I started it during the Walk of Britain. So right now I'm using this as my main format, where I upload, every time I'm on a walk, I'll upload like the daily narrative with a picture, which I think helps to summarize the idea. I think I actually really like the format because it gives you the image to sort of anchor your ideas, and then the narrative flows from there. So I'm using Instagram, and the address is my name, so it's at Danielle Marie Hurren. And I think I'm going to start a more of a official blog as well, because I know some people have written to me and told me they don't use Instagram, so it's really good to have a blog format as well. But for now, I put everything on Facebook sites that are appropriate for each walk, and Instagram. So yeah, if anyone would like to check out the Instagram, that would be super. All of the walks, my 2 Caminos and my Walk of Britain, are detailed and have been written up there.
Okay, what I will do is I'll make sure that the links are put up also on my site as well. And also this will be on YouTube in a couple of days' time, and I'll make sure that the links are there as well. Well, Danielle, thank you very much. That was an extraordinary, enlightening discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And we need to stay in touch and have a catch up when you do your next walks as well. So thank you again, and thanks for spending an hour with us. That was really wonderful. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye. Right. That was excellent. Thank you very much. Really, really good.
Thank you. That was such a good conversation.
It was. It could have gone on for ages, but very, very
yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, I've got to shoot now. So all the best to you. And we'll stay in touch. I'll let you know when it's up. Okay, then.
Okay. Perfect.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.